In that speech, Gara expressed, as he put it, and I quote, a disquiet about the way we in the foundation world, along with the organizations we support and the infrastructure many of us have helped to build, have mirrored trends in the political world to talk about what we do and why we are doing it in ways that have strayed too far from first principles. He continues, we have become more about the fix, the intervention, to use a horribly dominant word in the field that calls to mind invading armies, than about the reasons for doing or caring about it. In marching under the flag of what works, and in particular what can be proven or demonstrated through the rigors of evidence, we risk straying too far from what is right. I think it's time to strike a better balance, he concludes. The Bradley Center thought that this was a terrific stimulant for a conversation, one of our monthly panels here at the Bradley Center.
I have had a feeling for a while that in the movement in philanthropy and the nonprofit world generally toward a greater degree of pragmatism and a focus on effectiveness, and along with that very often metrics, which is not a trend that I entirely decry by any means. I've worked both at the Open Society Institute, where George Soros didn't really put much truck in evaluation or metrics and was kind of intuitive philanthropist. You know, I've known over the years Jim Pearson, who was the president of the Olin Foundation, another spend-down foundation like Atlantic Philanthropies, and having interviewed him both for my class and in various public settings, I know that when you ask the question about Olin, of how did they think about evaluation and so on, they don't really have as much to say as, let's say, the Hewlett Foundation would. And yet, the Olin Foundation, in my view, in its relatively brief life, was a tremendously effective foundation. I don't agree with many of the things that the Olin Foundation supported. I'm on a different point in the ideological spectrum, but I think it's undeniable that they had a significant impact on public policy and on the way people think about things, even while not having all the language of metrics and all the apparatus of that. So Atlantic Philanthropies, when I came there, I think was squarely in the community of foundations that arose in the last 10 or 15 years in what I would call a kind of an effectiveness movement. I mean, Phil, from CEP, who's here today, is a key figure in that. Edna McConnell Clark, Hewlett, number of foundations, institutions, GEO, which I think Kathleen is here today. And I think that's a very important movement in philanthropy. My own roots are more in what you might call the social justice movement in philanthropy, and I believe that the right place to be is in some marriage of those two. So it's not a point that I'm not making a point that we need to abandon all concern with measurability and impact and effectiveness, and I think there's much good about those movements. But the disquiet I've had, that I talk about at some length in the speech, with the way much of philanthropy is developed, is because that it has become largely unhinged from the basic values which ought to animate philanthropy.
So in reflecting on what Gara said at MIT, I mean, the short answer, and particularly as a grant seeker, I agree. And I don't have a lot actually to challenge in terms of the speech itself. I think that there are some fundamental parts of the larger conversation it actually calls us to that I wanted to highlight, which is, if we think about some of the tension underlying this issue of, whether the role of philanthropy is to be accountable in a narrow sense to a particular sets of metrics and outcomes, and then what are those, and then creates a log frame model to identify that, without a discussion of what we are actually trying to produce in the country, what we are trying to produce more wholly, more holistically, and more largely beyond what the foundation itself does, right? If we assume that that's much of what's talked about, that's the tension point. Are we producing a longer term, larger impact, or are we trying to make sure that the actual specific dollars that are put out there do what the program officer said to his or her higher ups it would do?
I agreed with more of what Gara said just now than I did when I read his talk, and And I think, but I did disagree with some of what was in his talk. Let me first, though, start with what I liked about it. And I think there's a lot in that talk to be admired. So, for example, I agree with him that today our political discourse is too often focused on what's pragmatically possible, poll-driven pragmatism at the expense of moral clarity and moral courage. And I think whether the examples climate change or healthcare or immigration, all examples that Gara cites, we don't hear enough about what simply is right. I think you could also make the point that at this very moment in Washington, a little more focus on what is pragmatically possible might be helpful. But, you know, where I part company with Gara is when he asserts that this problem has infected philanthropy, or when he suggests that there's some disconnect in philanthropy between the moral case for what we do and the quest to understand what works. Or when he seems to imply that the fact that too many foundations are entrenched in fixed and safe positions, and I would agree, is attributable to a focus on effectiveness, when I would argue the opposite is the case. So Gara says in his talk, in marching under the flag of what works, and in particular what can be proven or demonstrated through the rigors of evidence, we risk straying too far from what is right. And I guess I would say we stray from what is right when we do not assess. This is, after all, about the people we seek to help. And if we don't do the necessary work to confirm that we are, in fact, helping, then we're falling short of our moral obligation.
It is one thing to embrace morally laden goals, another thing to be able to achieve them. This is a familiar problem summarized in the old saying that wishing won't make it so. Even, I might add, with all the money Bill Gates has to spend behind it. There are lots of reasons for this. We don't always know how to achieve our goals, or the means themselves may be objectionable on moral or other grounds. Important as it could be, philanthropy always and inevitably has its limits, especially in a free society, which may make its accomplishments a pale imitation of its aspirations. One might even wonder if associating with the amounts of money found in some philanthropies these days may make it more difficult to be realistic about what one can reasonably accomplish. Some of you have heard the old joke about what it's like to work for a foundation. 3 things will never happen to you again. You will never eat in anything but a first-class restaurant, sleep in anything but a first-class hotel, or have anyone tell you the truth about yourself and what you are doing to your face. And that makes it very hard to keep your feet on the ground and very easy to think that what you believe to be right is something that you can obtain.